Hi friends. My friend, she won't eat grapes because she thinks they will soar her blood sugars through the roof. And in fact, she's been told by medical professionals that because she has blood sugar issues, she should avoid all fruits. But could they be wrong? So have you ever noticed how some meals will send your blood sugars through the roof while others barely make a ripple? Sometimes it's the same food and it's obviously the same person, but a different day and you can get completely different reactions. So for years, I thought the problem was carbohydrates. Rice, bread, potatoes, fruit. Naturally, these carbs should be destroying your blood sugars, right? Believe it or not, that's actually wrong. And I didn't see it at first because every time I ate refined carbohydrates, my blood sugars would shoot up too. So yesterday, I was actually serving fruit at a teen youth foundation. And a parent, she came up to me and she said the exact same thing that my friend has been claiming for years. I love fruit, but I can't eat too much because my blood sugars spike up. And I literally was trying to tell her that yes, in the short term, that may happen, but in the long term, the more fruit you eat, the better your blood sugars will be. But she was so focused on the spike, the immediate number that people get after eating carbohydrates, that it really inhibited her from looking at fruit as a solution to your blood sugar problems. And somehow, I think people think that's like counterintuitive. Now, at one point, I was like her too. I avoided fruit. I actually blamed them for sugar spikes. I feared them until I realized something almost nobody talks about, the real problem. And the real problem wasn't fruit or whole food carbohydrates. The real problem was actually what was happening inside my metabolism before the carb ever even hit my bloodstream. And once you fix the root of the cause, your body can suddenly tolerate the same foods and yes, even fruit, rice, potatoes, and bread without blowing up your blood sugars to sky-high levels. So in this video, we're going to uncover the real root cause of prediabetes and diabetes type 2. So with the holidays coming up, how can you eat carbs without spiking your blood sugars? So on the surface, sure, skipping carbs or eating them with fat and protein, in theory, they sound good, right? You can stick to other more delicious food. Keep it simple. Yet, have you noticed something metabolic that almost nobody talks about? What raises your blood sugar dramatically isn't actually the food you think it is. It's something that lingers in your cells long after the last grape is gone or your meal is done. Something that changes the way your muscles, they open the door to glucose. It's something that determines whether your carbohydrate becomes your cleanest fuel or your sharpest blood sugar spike. And yes, the banter online is simply distracting people from the real problem, the forgotten physiology, the lost medical history, and the simple daily habits that were quietly buried over the last 100 years with this processed food era. Now, the problem with type 2 diabetes and prediabetes is really not about cutting healthy carbs. It's about unlocking them. And once you understand the mechanism, your relationship with carbs, especially the fruit that you were told to fear, will change forever. So most people think carb spike blood sugars and that fat protects it. But that is really only the immediate effect. The long term is actually opposite. The part that you see that is falsely leading you astray is the immediate blood sugar effect. Now, remember, don't judge a book by its cover. The long-term effect is opposite of what is happening in the short term. So when you eat a high-fat meal, let's say you add oil or butter or cheese or fatty meats or heavy proteins, the fat doesn't just disappear into thin air, right? It slips in your muscle tissues and it quietly interferes with the insulin signaling for glucose control for hours. Now, microscopic droplets of fat, they build up around the insulin receptor and around the GLUT4 transporter, the very doorway glucose needs to enter the muscle. So it's actually a door blocker. And when these doorways are blocked, it doesn't matter how much insulin the pancreas makes. Glucose can't get in. And yesterday, I was actually wandering around the building trying to find the entrance to volunteer. I tried so many doors. I even almost walked into a wedding and some of them were locked. Now it would have been just a fun adventure, except that it was raining pretty hard. And I am like the glucose stuck outside in the pouring rain wanting to go in. The thing is, it wasn't just me. It was actually lots of parents who were stuck outside in the rain. And because there was a collective amount of people, our group was noticed. So likewise, when enough glucose builds up in your blood sugar will get noticed. It's going to have those high spikes, even if you ate something as gentle and as clean as fruit. Fat literally delays emptying the stomach contents, period. So if it never empties, you will never absorb any of the food. And sure, if the carbs are stuck in your stomach within a couple hours, blood sugars should not be spiking, right? And that's exactly what you see. However, eventually, the contents in your stomach will be released. And when that carbohydrate finally leaves your stomach, your blood sugar will stay higher for longer because of all the other crap that is along with the food, like the saturated fat. So why would anybody want to do that? Fool themselves to think that they can eat carbs and fat and be okay with it. Let me give you some examples. Buttered toast, croissant, ham and sausage with pancakes or waffles. And don't forget, people usually put butter and whipped cream on these carbs as well, right? How about combining them baked together like a muffin or a cake? These are very common everyday foods that so many people eat, and they don't realize that when you pair the fat, especially with refined carbs, that really keeps your blood sugars higher for longer. And the effect isn't just for one meal. In fact, if you keep eating like that, all your meals will turn into blood sugar spikes whenever you eat any sort of carbohydrates, even super healthy ones. So you become carb intolerant because your fat is blocking your metabolism. It is well known that low-fat, whole food carbohydrates really work well to keep your blood sugars low. But people forgot about that. And so you have to go back in time when around insulin was first used. So in the 1920s and 1930s, doctors finally had a tool, insulin, to save the lives of patients with type 1 diabetes. And back then, type 2 diabetes was really rare. Because you remember, that was around the Great Depression. You can't get type 2 diabetes when you don't have access to a lot of food. Now, people back then had the opposite body type of people today. The majority of people back then were super duper skinny. And if you had type 1 diabetes in the 1920s, that was really a deadly diagnosis. And it was deadly until insulin was on the market, which not only extended the life of type 1 diabetics, but it also made them feel better. And now they could eat all the carbs that they wanted and still have normal blood sugars. And something unexpected happened. As doctors increased insulin doses, largely because their patients were eating high-fat diets, mortality actually went up. People all of a sudden weren't dying from the lack of insulin. They were dying because they needed too much insulin. High-fat diets made the patients more insulin resistant. And it only shows when you eat carbs. So when you eat those carbs, your blood sugars go up, you get more complications. That means higher mortality. So enter the brilliance of a small group of physicians who saw the pattern and began questioning the approach. Instead of increasing insulin, they actually focused on reducing the need for insulin. And how do you reduce your need for insulin? One way is to eliminate all carbohydrates. That's common sense, right? But they actually didn't do that. Doctors did that prior to the discovery of insulin. And that was really the only way to extend the life of those with type 1 diabetes. Doctors were already prescribing a version of the ketogenic diet, but these patients always felt bad because they need carbohydrates for energy. However, after insulin was on the market, they discovered quite the opposite, that patients who ate low-fat diets and just focused on carbohydrates, they actually did better. Of course, they kept their proteins low and they felt good and their blood sugars actually stabilized dramatically. And when you do that, your insulin needs plummet. So now we know that insulin is an inflammatory hormone. They didn't know that before. And this is why when people increase their insulin dose to chase after blood sugars, they get kidney damage, heart disease, and atherosclerosis. But when they keep dietary fat low, despite eating junky refined carbohydrates, their markers, including their blood sugars, actually improve. And some patients came off insulin entirely. But of course, you shouldn't do this on your own. If you have any questions about your diet, and especially if you're taking medications, you should see your own medical doctor for advice. Most people don't realize this, but the very first doctors who tried using high carbohydrate diets to treat diabetes were doing it, like I said, about a century ago, long before keto, low carb, or carb fear ever existed. And then in the 1920s and 1930s, a Canadian physician named Dr. Rabanowitz in Montreal, he quietly began reversing diabetic symptoms using a diet that was high in carbohydrates and naturally very low in fat. So his patients saw better blood sugars, fewer episodes of acidosis, and far more stability than those on the traditional high-fat starvation-style diets of their era. 20 years later, in the 1940s, Dr. Walter Kebner at Duke University, he took it even further and invented the famous rice diet, a diet that was almost entirely carbohydrate with virtually zero fat. And he saw dramatic drops in blood sugar, blood pressure, reversal of kidney damage, and even improvement in diabetic eye disease. These early pioneers discovered something medicine ignored for decades. And that is when you take out the fat, the body suddenly becomes more sensitive to insulin. And the same carbs that once spike your blood sugars, like these grapes, they begin to behave completely different in your body. So in the 40s, Dr. Kepner documented cases of patients with blood sugars over 300 who normalized their levels after eating a diet of rice, fruit, juice, and sugar. Yeah, it was extremely low carbohydrate. Vision, skin, kidney markers, they all improved. People's high blood pressure corrected. So it wasn't the sugar because they were eating it. It was the absence of fat that allowed insulin sensitivity to return and insulin to stop destroying health. The history was later overshadowed by the rise of high-fat diets and big pharma peddling a solution of pills. But the physiology never changed. Fat still slows insulin function. Carbs work best, especially carbs with low in fat and high in fiber. But with people, there are more issues about cutting carbs because not all carbs are equal. So when we talk about carbs, most people lump every carbohydrate together as if sugar was the same as this bowl of grapes. They are not. Carbohydrates inside whole fruits like mangoes and grapes or oats, they behave very differently than simple sugars that are in soda. Obviously, a packet of sugar looks nothing like these grapes. Carb quality is super duper important. These grapes have a fiber casing, the skin, the cell wall, pectin, and some starches have resistant starch, structures that slow digestion, feed your microbiome, and lower the glycemic impact or lower your blood sugars. Now, whole plants, not plant-based, they give you carbohydrates wrapped inside soluble fiber, insoluble fiber, as well as resistant starch. And the phytonutrients, they literally can change how your blood sugar rises and how your insulin responds. Now, this is the opposite of refined starches like wheat flour, cornstarch, potato starch, bread flour, or white rice. They're concentrating the starch and they stripping away the fibers. Some of these fibers, like carrageenan or isolated gum, these substances have never existed before in nature, not in concentrated form. And carrageenan itself actually can damage the gut lining instead of nourishing it. So real carbs actually grow in the ground, intact, fruit, beans, lentils, vegetables, roots, and tubers. Carbohydrate molecules on the same may look alike, but the delivery system makes a world of difference. The natural architecture of this fiber is what transforms it from being a blood sugar bomb to metabolic medicine.
Hi friends, I am so thrilled that you want to take charge of your health and take charge of your food. Now, I know nutrition can be complex, but it doesn't have to be. And I'm here to support you in this lifelong journey. So if you point your camera app to this QR code, it'll take you to a link for a free handout that I created just for you. And if you like it, if you want to see other handouts, please go to the link in my show notes and then you can leave me your feedback on what I could do to help you in your journey. Okay, back to the video now.
An industry has taken advantage of the public's ignorance, including my own, and are concentrating food additives like carrageenan. Carrageenan is actually used by research to stimulate inflammation in animal models. And yet there are so many food scientists that say these additives, they're in such little amounts that it doesn't matter. And that's the story they tell themselves because they know people eat more than just that one food that they're making with the additive. The public obviously is okay with this narrative because they still keep eating it. So if you're eating foods laced with artificial anything, especially the ones that you can't pronounce, you may want to rethink it. And you'll have doctors and PhDs go on air to say it's okay to drink soda, even diet, right? I mean, there's something wrong with our culture when they're trying to tell people to go eat junk food, that it's okay. We have confused real food like grapes with chemicals like table sugar. So let's go back to carrageenan. It's really an ingredient found in plant milk, and I used to drink a bunch of it. Carrageenan is a highly processed, isolated gum extracted from red seaweed and used by the food industry as a thickener, a stabilizer, and emulsifier. It really doesn't behave like natural dietary fiber. And carrageenan actually is a sulfated polysaccharide extracted from the Chondrus crispus or Irish moss, another form of red algae. Carrageenan is a chemically altered product to create gel-like substance and is used, again, in plant milks and creams and deli meats, chocolate milk, yogurt, and many, creamy processed food to improve its texture. And it kind of stimulates fat. Now, even though it comes from a seaweed, what ends up in the food is not intact whole food. It's a chemical. It's an industrial additive. And research has shown that it can disrupt your gut integrity, and it may activate inflammatory pathways like NF-kappa B and interleukin 8. It can worsen colitis in susceptible individuals. And when you get your gut microbiome altered, it gets out of balance, and then you have more leaky gut, intestinal permeability. When your intestines are permeable, you better believe that that's going to cause a massive amount of inflammation. Now, carrageenan is not the same as whole seaweed or algae. It's really a concentrated chemical process. It may be fragrant like a fiber, but it's still highly processed. And carrageenan has lost the protective matrix of the whole food fiber that was once in. So that's one thing I would avoid. There is, however, one starch that I think is beneficial. It's actually forgotten about, and that is resistant starch. Resistant starch is a forgotten advantage. And so how you make resistant starch is to cool your starches before you eat them, because cooling of the starch makes it more resistant to digestion. So you could cook your rice, potatoes in advance and put them in the refrigerator overnight. And then the next day you can reheat it. But some of that starch has changed its structure. That's why it tastes a little different. And you don't have the enzymes to digest resistant starch. So instead of turning it into glucose, it travels to the colon where your gut bacteria ferment it into short-chain fatty acids like butyrate, which then improves your insulin sensitivity, it lowers your inflammation, it strengthens your gut lining, and reduces sugar spikes. So a cold reheated potato will spike your blood sugars less than a fresh one. And this is the same food, but it's different responses. And this is one of the simplest way to enjoy carbohydrates while keeping the metabolic costs low. So for the holidays, if you're going to be hosting, you can always take advantage of that principle and pre-cook your meals and refrigerate it. Or if you're a guest, and you can just do food order. The sequence that you eat your food can change your blood sugars. So if you eat your carbs first, let's say bread or pasta or rice, you will get a sharp sugar spike. So yesterday we went to eat at a Mexican restaurant, and my friend ordered this giant bowl of chips and salsa. The chips were as big as a tortilla, and that's a lot of carbs and fat, right? Because they deep fried the chips. So I really wanted to try one because it was so crispy, but I'm not into destroying my metabolism with deep fried carb-laden foods. My friend, she was trying to lose weight, so she was just snacking a chip here or there. But you know how much calories those chips have? Half a bag of fresh chips is about 500 calories. And that is literally the amount of calories that is worth an entire meal. So every time you eat your breadsticks at the Olive Garden, that's 140 calories. Or the bread at Outback Steakhouse has 370 calories. And what makes people gain weight faster is the fact that they eat the fat with the carbohydrates. And when you do that, your blood sugars will go higher. Your insulin will go higher to meet up with the sugar. And now you have insulin chasing sugars over and over when fat is what is plugging up the insulin. Insulin is a fat storing hormone. And that's why it's important to skip those highly refined carbohydrates when you first go to a party, and instead eat foods that are high in fiber first. A lot of people talk about that now because they figured out that it works. However, I figured that out in high school. I was really an overweight person in junior high. And in fact, I was the biggest kid in my school. And then I noticed my weight dropping every time I would eat more fresh fruits and vegetables. But it would go back up every time I went off my diet. And those would be the days that I would be skipping my fruit and vegetables. So since high school, I realized that the way to control my diet was to start my meals with fruits and vegetables. Now, my friend this weekend was talking about being on a smoothie diet. All she was eating was smoothies. And her boss dropped 16 pounds just by eating smoothies. It was within a month. So that boss was losing a ton of weight, including a ton of muscle weight, which isn't healthy if you're trying to age with grace and achieve longevity. Too many people just rely on weight as a marker or blood sugar as a marker. Sure, you're going to be losing weight. I mean, how long are you going to be on that diet? How long can you drink a smoothie, right? Is that a forever diet? For most people, I would say no. Guess what? As soon as you stop the diet, if you don't train yourself on eating the right foods all the time, you'll basically skyrocket or torpedo your weight back on again. Hence, I'm not a proponent of dieting. I'm a proponent of building sustainable lifelong habits. Sustainability means that wherever you go, whatever situation you're placed in, holiday parties and office parties, I usually, when I attend those functions, I hit the fruit bar first. Frankly, I want something sweet and crunchy and hydrating to fill my stomach up so that I don't need to be eating too much of those tasty refined carbohydrates with a ton of fat and protein. But wait, you may say that the protein will make make you full and reduce your blood sugar spikes? Well, like I said, insulin is what we have to worry about. And the data shows that animal protein will spike blood sugars higher than plant proteins. And plant proteins in general are more protective. And that's why I always eat a lot of plants. But I don't want to eat plant-based. I want to eat whole food plants. And the fiber in whole foods, it traps the protein as well as the blood sugars. We're talking about high fiber, high protein foods like beans and legumes and nuts and seeds. And sometimes people don't serve these items. So either, I'm going to eat them at home first, or I will pack myself some snacks in my purse. The key to fiber is to eat enough of it and to eat it with every meal. Otherwise, the carbohydrates will spike higher. But with fiber, the stomach releases glucose more slowly. However, more importantly, the intestine gradually absorbs glucose. And then that's a feedback loop that shuts off the liver from making insulin. So far the rule is clean and simple. Vegetables and fruits first. Beans and lentils should be second. Carbs should be last. And at the very end, if you still have room in your tummy to put a little bit of that junk food, well, just know that you should only be putting a little bit, right? You don't want to eat all those cakes and cookies. And if you're going to the restaurant, I'm sure your waiter or waitress would love to help you out there. And it's important to always try to pair food. Most people pair carbs with fat. That's like the wrong kind of pairing. So you don't want to add the fat or the butter on the cheese or potatoes or, oil on the pasta or putting butter on rice. It delays your stomach emptying to then just delay your sugar spikes. That'll be worsened because it caused insulin resistance. So here's a right way to pair carbs. Eat it with high fiber vegetables, spices and vinegars, herbs, beans and lentils, and leafy greens and intact grains. So vinegar, it activates metabolism to help you lower your sugars. Fiber not only slows the rate of glucose absorption, but some of the glucose simply won't be absorbed because it's going to be trapped in the fiber and then pooped out. And then you have water-rich foods that will dilute the calorie density dramatically from your fruit and vegetables. So don't forget spices like cinnamon, cumin, fenugreek, black pepper, ginger. They all naturally help you metabolize your food better. They improve their taste and they actually improve the insulin sensitivity. You're controlling your blood sugars without needing oil, butter, or fat. It's also super important to start every meal hydrated. You want to find hydrated, low-calorie foods, which is a secret of being full without feeling deprived or having the sugar spikes. So most people, they spike not because the food is high in carbs, but because they're eating dry, processed, calorie-dense carbs. So compare these to typical wet foods, and these are the typical dry foods like bread, crackers, chips, cereals, pastries, which often already have fat and salt, right? Fat, salt, and sugar, that is a winning combination. Not only will it spike your sugars, but it'll keep them high for longer. So however, if you eat water-rich whole foods like fresh fruit and vegetables, beans, stews, soups, berries, grains, maybe oats cooked in water, they have less calories because the water dilutes the food, including the glucose load, right? It reduces your calories instead of reducing your volume. And the volume triggers stress receptors, and this helps to lower the blood sugar spikes so that your blood sugars get a gentle wave up instead of a giant spike up. And then if you add spices like vinegar or, turmeric or ginger, these are small, but they're mighty tools. They have super big impact. Vinegar has acidic acid, and the acid lowers the blood sugar impact in your meals. Now, vinegar with a meal reduces the liver from reducing glucose, and also it improves insulin sensitivity. And don't forget, I have mentioned spices like cinnamon. That improves insulin sensitivity too. Turmeric, it reduces inflammation. Black cumin, it actually is used for weight loss, and it has an effect on insulin levels. Ginger, it improves digestion as well as your muscle glucose uptake. Cumin improves digestion and glucose curves. These are all ancient foods with modern evidence that they are anti-inflammatory. And what about movement after meals? Do you do it? A 10-minute quick walk. And if you target it after eating your meals, you can actually reduce your blood sugar levels just about immediately. And this is because you're moving big muscles like your quads and your calves, your soleus, your gluteals. These are glucose sinks or metabolic powerhouses. And when it contracts, it pulls the glucose out of the bloodstream. You can walk you can clean your kitchen, you can climb your stairs, you can even walk your dog, right? These are all daily habits that we should be doing to stimulate and improve our blood sugars. And then there's timing. Now, people who eat at night simply get bigger metabolic problems because your pancreas and liver, they are tied to your circadian rhythm. So in the evening, your insulin sensitivity drops and then your melatonin increases, your insulin actually gets increased, but your glucose stays high longer. So it's important to eat 3 hours before bed. Keep it low in fat, high in fiber, and well hydrated. And you may be wondering what you could eat, right? How about for breakfast? Oats cooked with water. Add some berries, cinnamon, maybe ground flax and chia. Just add a little bit, right? Drink some green tea with your breakfast or separately for your breakfast. And there's lots of other grains to explore with, as well as lots of other vegetables. Those are all great options for food. And then, why not eat a salad, right? Add some beans and vegetables, or you can take that vegetable, make it into a vegetable soup. Now, if you eat cooled, reheated potatoes or rice, and then you add some vinegar, you can actually reduce your blood sugar spikes even more. Don't forget to start all your meals with fruit, and you can also eat it as dessert. To tolerate carbs, remember, keep your fat content to less than 10%. Eat whole foods. You can add spices and vinegar. Move after your meals, and really, you can use leftovers, especially cooked starches. It's good to cook them the day before and refrigerate them. You don't want to just flatten your post-meal curves. You want your energy to return. My friend, she actually told me she didn't realize that her body could feel normal again. But she's not broken. She was just pretty backed up with fat. And once the fat left, her metabolism and checked itself. And this is really how the body's designed to work. When we're in caloric deficit, we burn the fat. And when we are in surplus, we store the fat. So carbs, they're not really the enemy. It's the saturated fat. And that's why it's important to know what carbs to eat. And if you want to know more about that, watch the next video.